When it comes to animation in video games, the fighting game genre is one that comes to my mind as a genre where animation matters the most. Whereas other game genres have grand, story-filled adventures that bring the characters through a journey that allow them to express their personalities in a 10 to 20 hour adventure at minimum, fighting games generally do not have large-scale story modes and have too many characters for any singular story to get all the focus. Thus, all of a character's personality traits and characterization have to come from the gameplay itself, and the animations have to do all the talking. Fighting games have many distinct characters across 30 plus years, from martial arts experts to samurais to schoolgirls and tanks? Thus, certain techniques have to be utilized to help bring these characters to life. In Ollie Johnston and Frank Thomas's 1981 book The Illusion of Life, the two Disney animators went over the 12 principles of animation. These 12 principles are used as the basis for character animation even to this day. The animators for fighting games incorporate these principles into their own games and characters. While all 12 of the principles are incorporated, I'm going to highlight a few key elements that are especially prevalent and important for fighting games. Anticipation is used for preparing the audience for an action to come out. This is especially important for here, as different moves tend to have anticipation frames called startup frames that indicate to the player that a move is about to be thrown out. Let's look at Ryu here. Notice how he is reeling his entire body back before he lets out a straight punch. This is to not only show the opponent that an attack is about to come out and to defend themselves, but to give Ryu's punch more impact for once it does hit. You can see this when Ryu is throwing a fireball as well. He shifts his body backwards for the audience to anticipate him throwing out a projectile. And this is shown for every single move in a fighting game. Staging is used to show the audience where their attention should be directed. This can also go hand in hand with overall character design. Look at Chun-Li here, for example. Her character design brings emphasis to her legs, as they tend to have a different shade from the rest of her body, and they also tend to be larger in size compared to the rest of her body. This isn't so much because the artist was bad in anatomy, but this is to show that you should be focusing on her legs. As you see in her animations, the audience is supposed to be directed to her legs, as her fighting style predominantly revolves around kicking. This is possibly the most important factor in fighting game animation, specifically pose to pose, where character moves are drawn via keyframes. Keyframes are individual drawings of different poses and actions that later have other frames drawn in between to complete the animation. This is especially important in fighting games, as they tend to be fast-paced affairs that run at a full 60 frames per second. Thus, key posing is the easiest way to tell what the character is doing at a very quick moment's notice. Keyframes for each move can be summed up as 3 stages: anticipation, activity, and recovery. The anticipation, as explained previously, is the startup of the move where the audience anticipates a move coming out. The activity is when the move actually comes out and when the attack is active and most lethal. Finally, the recovery is when the character finishes the animation by going back to their original position. Let's take a look at a few keyframes from various different games. Every piece of animation in a fighting game follows these basic principles in order for the animation to show up clearly in a fast-paced environment. Follow-through and overlapping action are principles that both refer to different actions separate from the main animation frames that give the animation more life. The company SNK is famous for emphasizing the clothing on their characters for the sake of animating follow-through and overlapping actions. Here we see the character Rock Howard performing multiple actions, but pay attention specifically to his jacket. While the real emphasis on the animations are on Rock's movements, his jacket is always animated alongside each frame to not only make his animations feel more realistic, but to also draw emphasis to how Rock himself is moving. Exaggeration is the technique where certain parts of the human body are blown out of realistic proportion in order to give emphasis to a specific movement to give the illusion of realism. This is done by breaking the human body in between different frames. Characters' joints will bend, stretch, and perform impossible feats with their body proportions to give better emphasis to each individual frame. Spider-Man here, for example, is stretching his body parts out multiple times to give emphasis on what limbs are in focus for each move. He's a very close-range mobile character, so exaggeration is important for letting the player know Spider-Man's fighting style. Solid drawing is fairly self-explanatory. It involves taking into consideration how much volume and weight a drawing has and taking into account various degrees of three-dimensional space. While fighting games generally are seen from a two-dimensional plane with only the X and Y axis being taken into account, Some games do have full 3-dimensional space, such as Tekken or Soul Calibur. Even then, the artist must have a basic understanding of drawing from life, how the human body looks, and how the human body moves to create animation that's true to life. This is especially important in terms of the previous principle, where in order to break and exaggerate the human body, an artist needs to learn the human body and how specifically to break said human body. An animation is carried by artists and animators, even when the source of the animation does not come from a drawing per se. A common criticism of games from NetherRealm Studios, primarily their Mortal Kombat series of games, is that the games use motion capture to animate their characters exclusively. While this shows impressive movement with how characters' faces animate or how characters express themselves and move in different cinematic moments thanks to the wonderful choreography, it can lead to issues elsewhere. Animators need to come in to finish the job, or else you come out with janky animations that makes the characters' movements lose their appeal. Finally, when bringing all the principles together, it is important to have a character design that can appeal to a wide audience. This may be the most subjective point of these principles, but it is important for characters in fighting games to be designed as if to signify what exactly they're trying to be. Depending on the developer, characters will be designed to emphasize different elements. Capcom's character designs, for example, tend to focus more on human physique to emphasize the different parts of the body in terms of their animation. That would explain why Street Fighter characters tend to be more muscular than a real human and wear tight clothing that give emphasis to their musculature. This especially shows when they recreated different Marvel superheroes for their Marvel vs. Capcom series of games. SNK, as stated previously, emphasizes clothing in their character designs, as they focus more on follow-through animation and how the clothing moves in order to emphasize the arcs that characters move in. Fighting games with an art style inspired by anime, such as those games from Arc System Works or French Bread, tend to emphasize flashy elements heavily pronounced by weapon and body strikes that emulate how dynamic movement is in the anime genre. This is especially shown when Arc System Works developed Dragon Ball FighterZ, where they very closely analyzed and recreated each and every single piece of animation that was shown in both the manga and the anime. This was also shown when French Bread developed Dengeki Bunko Fighting Climax, when they brought together characters from anime series such as Sword Art Online, Durarara, and somehow even Toradora. Overall, while Johnston and Thomas wrote up on the 12 principles of animation, possibly to apply more to animated film, these guidelines proved to be so potent in how animating characters works that it can be applied to video games. The fighting game genre has been experimenting with different methods of animation for about 30 years now. Developers continue to innovate on their character animation in different ways, to the point where we now have games that properly mimic reality, perfectly replicate different forms of animation, and even properly bring to life a tank.